First, I want to welcome everyone who is joining us for the ICD-10-PCS coding for coronary bypass. Hopefully that's what everybody is here for today. I also would like to introduce you all to Christy Pollard, your speaker for today. I always get a chuckle when I read Christy's bio because I am also a Colorado native that has never skied before. So I think it might just be a Colorado native thing, I'm not sure. But anyways, Christy is our lead developer with over 20 years of experience. She is a talented teacher and instructor. Her presentations are always engaging and very informative. And I always enjoy sitting in on her webinars because I always learn something. So grab a cup of coffee, relax, and enjoy today's presentation. Christy, are you ready?
Thank you, Michelle. I am ready as I'm ever going to be. Today's presentation on coronary artery bypass graft coating for ICD-10-PCS is a little bit of a follow-up for me. Last week I got to do the same presentation on CPT, so if you are interested in that and missed it, make sure to check it out. But on today's agenda, we are going to be doing just a brief overview of anatomy that's related to cabbage coating, and that's pretty standard for any of my procedural webinars that I do. We'll talk about different methods of achieving coronary artery bypass grafting or cabbage, and differentiate between aortocoronary and mammary artery bypass grafts, and even more. And quite often when I talk to people about anything that has any type of coating related to the heart, I usually get the response of, oh my goodness, that's so confusing and it's so overwhelming. And I find it fascinating, and I think the heart stuff is the stuff that I like the most. So hopefully if you feel that way about heart procedures, by the end of today, I'll turn things around a little bit for you and you won't find them quite as intimidating. So quick review of anatomy and guidelines. And the first guideline that I always like to pull out, and I think it's probably my favorite PCS guideline, is A11, which talks about the fact that it is our responsibility as coders to read what's in the record and translate that into the PCS codes and the PCS definitions. And we don't expect our physicians to use the same terminology that we as coders use, but it kind of solidifies the need for us to have a really strong understanding of anatomy and the procedural process and how these procedures are performed. It seems pretty simple and straightforward. We're talking about coronary artery bypass, and lucky for us, this is one area where the physician's terminology lines up with our terminology for bypass, the root operation bypass. And there's one table, it's the 021 table, that we're really going to be zeroing in on today. We'll talk about some other tables as well, but this is the one where we're going to spend the bulk of our time. And it's one table and really just 2 rows within this one table, and lots of possibilities for code assignment. And I want to break down, first of all, the procedures, but then, really zero in on each of these rows and the qualifiers and the devices and when we use which of those particular values. So the first part, there are a lot of guidelines that we are going to apply that are applicable to coronary artery bypass. And, first of all, the procedural intent is we've got blockage within the coronary arteries, and so we want to create a detour around that blockage and reestablish blood flow. If you think of it really as a plumbing issue, we're trying to get blood to the muscle of the heart so that it will continue to live and won't die, because of course when the heart muscle dies, then the heart stops beating and then the patient dies. So the root operation here for this procedural intent is bypass, and there are several guidelines, as I mentioned, that we'll be applying. The first couple refer to the body part, And those are, let me try to get my laser pointer going here, body part and qualifier values. Guidelines B3.6b and B3.6c are the ones that talk about how blood, that in the coronary arteries, we're going to be, our body part is going to be the body part that the bypass is going to, and the qualifier is the body part that it's coming from. Now, why didn't I print it out on this screen here for you? Because I think it's incredibly confusing when you just read the guideline. We're going to hit anatomy next, and after we talk about anatomy, then the guideline just kind of falls into place, and it's like, oh, okay, that makes sense. I don't really need the guideline if I understand the procedure and how blood is flowing through the heart. There is also a guideline B4.4 that talks about the coronary arteries body part. If you've been coding PCS for several years, you know that when we first implemented ICD-10-PCS, we coded coronary arteries by the number of sites, and they quickly changed that within the first year or two, so that we are now assigning codes based off of the coronary artery. So the artery itself, not the number of sites, and that's going to be important as we're looking at our selecting our body part of either 1, 2, or 3 or more, 3, 4 or more coronary arteries. There's also a guideline about excision for graft when it's taken from a separate operative site. Then we are going to be adding an additional code for the excision that's going to come into play with harvesting of graft material, usually the saphenous vein from the leg, but we'll look at some other sites where they could be taking that graft material as well. And then finally, devices. And remember that we consider it to be a device if it is left in the patient at the end of the procedure. There are a couple of kind of different nuances there that we'll talk about. We're going to talk about intra-aortic balloon pumps a little bit, as well as some of the ventricular assist devices like Impella that may be left at the end of a procedure. So that's the basic guidelines. If you wanted just, like a concise snapshot of which guidelines we'd be talking about today, those are them. So let's talk about coronary artery and aortic root anatomy. And I think this is important to know which way blood is flowing, because that's going to help us, again, to apply those guidelines about the body parts, and as well as the qualifiers. So the picture that we have here is the aortic root, and we took the heart out. So you would actually see the heart in here, in this area. As blood leaves the left ventricle of the heart, it immediately goes into the aorta, and the very first body part to get that fresh blood flow is the heart itself. So within the aorta, the two arteries that come off of the aorta first are the coronary arteries. So we have blood flowing out of the heart, through the aorta, and then into the coronary arteries. So we have blood flowing from the aorta to the coronary arteries. I know I keep repeating myself, but this is going to help us understand aortocoronary bypass and why it's done the way that it is. So our key concept here is that blood is moving away from the aorta to perfuse those coronary arteries. This, again, hails back to PCS guideline B3.6b, which says that the body part is the body part bypassed to. In the case of CABG, it is always going to be the coronary artery. And there are choices for coronary arteries are 1 artery, 2 artery, 3 arteries, or 4 or more arteries. The qualifier is the body part bypassed from. And if you're wondering why it is this way, if you recall, every other type of bypass is opposite of this. So every other type of bypass in the body, except for coronary arteries, the body part is the body part bypassed from, and the qualifier is the body part bypassed to. And that's because the body part of the coronary arteries is what keeps us in that 0 to 1 table in the heart and great vessels body system. So just remember your body part will always be coronary arteries, and your qualifier could change depending on whether your blood flow is coming directly from the aorta or another vessel off the aorta. So let's zero in a little bit closer and look at the coronary arteries. I love this picture. I use this picture in a lot of my presentations for a lot of my percutaneous coronary interventional stuff, as well as things like this where we really need to know the individual vessels. So remember, we've got 2 coronary arteries that come directly off of the aorta. And this picture is supposed to be shown in kind of a 3D so you can see around it. The coronary arteries come off the aorta and then spread around the heart, kind of like a skeleton on the outside of the heart so that we can get blood flow to each part of the heart muscle. The right coronary artery, RCA, comes off the right side, obviously, and then the left main coronary artery, which you may see abbreviated as LMCA or LCA, depending on your physician, divides immediately into 2 main branches. You've got the circumflex, which wraps around the back side of the heart, and then you've got the left anterior descending, or LAD, which goes down the front side of the heart and provides the bulk of the blood supply to the left ventricle. Now, left ventricle is a really important chamber. It is the biggest chamber of the heart, and it's the very last stop for blood before it leaves the heart and goes to the rest of the body. Because of that, this is the left ventricle that's really responsible for pumping blood to the rest of the body and thereby getting oxygen to all of the body parts. If you have a problem with the left ventricle, then you have a problem sustaining life. If you have a blockage in the LAD, which is providing the blood supply to the left ventricle, then you have a very lethal situation. And they call blockages and myocardial infarction in the LAD widowmakers because they need to be treated immediately, otherwise the patient will die. Now, off of each of those coronary arteries, so we have kind of 3 main branches, the right coronary artery, or RCA, the circumflex, and the LAD. And off of each of those, you've got other branches. And in PCS, these are considered to be separate coronary arteries. So if you did something in the main right coronary artery, but you also did a bypass to the acute marginal, that's 2 separate arterial sites that you're going to have to count in your body part character. And then for the left anterior descending, you have the diagonal branches. There can be 1 or 2 or more, depending on the anatomy of the patient, and the septal branches. And the circumflex, we have the obtuse marginal. A lot of times we see those as the OM branches documented in the operative report. And I would say that for me, learning these, when I was learning how to code, trying to determine what he was talking about in the operative report was one of the biggest challenges with all of the acronyms that he used. So I've tried to include all those acronyms on this slide that you would see for the different coronary arteries, because these are very common and very commonly documented in operative reports. So let's talk about counting coronary arteries. The coding guideline B4.4 that I talked about earlier says that the coronary arteries are classified as a single body part that is further specified by the number of arteries treated. One procedure code specifying multiple arteries is used when the same procedure is performed, including the same device and qualifier values. And we'll come back to this guideline later as we look at different bypasses that are, within a same procedure. They're using 2 different graft materials that have 2 different qualifiers. There is a coding clinic from 4th quarter of 2016 that addresses what I talked about on the previous slide, which is that each coronary artery and each branch off of a major coronary artery is considered to be a coronary artery when you're counting them for your body part. And that means that, like I said, if they did something in the main RCA, but also did a bypass to the right marginal, that would count as two different arteries, even though the right marginal is a branch off of the right coronary artery. That was a quick, very quick overview of anatomy. Now let's talk about the procedures. And the first type of bypass that we'll address is aortocoronary bypass. And specifically, we're talking about free grafts here. And this is a big deal. Free graft means that we are completely disconnecting a vessel and reattaching it. We're attaching one end to the aorta and we're attaching the other end to the coronary artery so that we can bypass the area of blockage. So in the picture here, this looks like it's the LAD. There's probably an area of blockage up in here. They want to get around that. So in order to do that, they just make a new anastomosis up here at the aorta and bring it down. What that graft is made of could be several different things. This one happens to be a saphenous vein graft from the leg, which is why we have a picture of the leg here. And this is going to code as bypass from the aorta to the coronary artery, and your body part, remember, body part's always going to be coronary artery, qualifier is going to be aorta, and then we are going to code the harvesting of that graft separately. This says when performed. That just means that, you know, sometimes it could be taken from a cadaver. In rare instances, you could have a patient who has a synthetic graft, in which case you're obviously not coding a harvest. But let's look at the coding and the table for this. So this is aortocoronary bypass coding. We're going to be in the first row of the 021 table here. We've got our body part, again, is going to be based on the number of coronary arteries that were bypassed. Approach is going to be open. And then the device, you're going to choose from any of these. And it means that the free graft meaning it was loose on both ends and it made two anastomoses, and it remains in place at the end of the procedure. And for an aortocoronary bypass, the proximal anastomosis is at the aorta, so the qualifier here is going to be aorta. It could be other things. It could be any of these other qualifiers that are listed here, but aorta is going to be most common. Now, mammary artery bypass is different. This is an in situ or a pedicle graft, where if you look at the anatomy of the mammary arteries, it comes off of the subclavian artery on both sides. So what you've got is the aorta. This happens to be a left internal mammary artery graft, where this is the left subclavian, and the left internal mammary artery naturally comes off of the subclavian artery, and then it runs right by the heart. So in a mammary artery bypass graft, they don't have to take this out completely. They just disconnect it at its distal end. They tie off that distal end that is no longer attached, and then they reroute this graft over past the area of the blockage. This requires only one anastomosis. So aortocoronary, you're having to sew that into both the coronary artery and the aorta, but in a mammary graft, you're only having to sew it in at the distal end. So this is not considered to be a device because it was not completely free when we used it in our bypass. Your body part, it's bypassed from the mammary artery to the coronary artery, so body part's always going to be the coronary artery. Your qualifier is going to be the mammary artery, either right or left, and we do have qualifiers for both. And because this is an in situ or pedicle graft, it's not free, it's not considered to be a device. And this is what the table looks like for this. So we've got, again, still the 021 table. We happen to be looking at the second row in this table now, where there are no device options. So if you recall, on the aortocoronary bypass, we had, venous tissue and arterial tissue and synthetic substance. Here we have no device because it was not free. And then the qualifier would either be the left or the right internal mammary artery, depending on which side it came from. And a quick shout out here before I go any further. I can't remember if I have a slide on this or not, but the internal thoracic artery is the same thing as the internal mammary artery. It's a newer term that physicians are starting to use. So if you see them doing, they call them LIDAs and RIDAs, and for left internal thoracic artery or right internal thoracic artery bypass, that would be the same thing as a LIMA or a RIMA bypass. And that already brings us into the first polling question.
Okay. We like to be interactive, so this is an opportunity to hear from you. If you're in a large group, please get a general consensus from the group when answering the polling question, and we'll do a brief discussion once we receive the majority of the answers. So our first question is, which device is used for an in situ LIMA graft? Autologous venous tissue, autologous arterial tissue, or no device? And we'll let you select your answer, and then we will do a little discussion. Let's see. Which device is used for an in situ LIMA graft? Autologous venous tissue, autologous arterial tissue, or no device? Getting a few more answers coming in. Give you a couple more seconds here. I always feel like we need the Jeopardy music going on when we do these polling questions. Okay, I think we got the majority of the answers, so I'm gonna go ahead and close this. And we have 10% who said autologous venous tissue, 15% said autologous arterial tissue, and 75% said no device.
Okay, so the LIMA graft, or left internal mammary artery graft, wouldn't be venous because there's no venous tissue involved at all. And it might be tempting to go with autologous arterial tissue, but the key word here is in situ, meaning that it was only disconnected from the distal end. It's not a free graft, and that's considered to be no device because it was not completely taken out of and put back into the body. All right, thank you, Michelle. And guess what? I did have a slide on the anatomy thing. Again, internal thoracic artery is the same thing as the internal mammary artery. You are going to use the qualifiers 8 or 9, whether it's left or right. There is a qualifier C for thoracic artery. That is not the correct qualifier to use for internal thoracic artery. Thoracic artery is more of a vague term that we would use for if there was some other vessel in the thoracic cavity that was used to bypass from. So this is one of those kind of behind the scenes things that I have not seen printed in coding clinic yet. Probably should be. We've talked pretty simple up until now. You know, the two main types of CABG would be aortocoronary or LIMA or RIMA graft. from using those in situ grafts. Well, it gets more complicated than that. And I would say most often what you'll probably see is a combination of the two. So you see a patient who's got quadruple bypass, and 3 of those vessels were using saphenous vein, aortocoronary grafts, and 1 was using an internal mammary artery. But they might also do some really fancy stuff using sequential or Y grafts. So let's talk first about what a sequential or a jump, I call it a jump graft, is. I don't have a picture of a sequential graft. I have a picture of the branching Y graft. But a sequential jump graft is where they would take a single graft segment, usually the saphenous vein, because it's a nice long piece of grafting material, and they use it to bypass 2 or more areas of blockage. And what you would see is this saphenous vein graft coming over and maybe hitting the right coronary artery, and they would connect it in a side-to-side fashion. If you look at the operative reports, he'll always tell you, I did a side-to-side anastomosis, or end-to-side, or end whatever. But the side-to-side means that he cut a hole in the side here, he cut a hole in the side here, but then he still has graft material left over, and he can use that to sew it into an end-to-side fashion further down. Now, if he did this on jumped from a right coronary artery to the right acute marginal, that's 2 coronary arteries that have been bypassed. In a similar fashion, the branching Y graft is also going to revascularize 2 separate different, that was awesome talking, Christy, 2 separate sites at the coronary artery. So this is a bifurcated graft, which is shown here. We happen to have an internal mammary artery graft, and then we've got this extra graft that's been sewn into the side of this Lima graft so that we can go over and revascularize a separate coronary artery. So we've got a single proximal attachment here, but we are looking at revascularizing 2 coronary arteries. Now, the impact to coding is that it can impact the body part character for the number of coronary arteries. And when you're counting your coronary artery vessels for bypass, you're always counting the distal connections. If we were to code this particular patient, then this would be 3 total coronary arteries that are being revascularized. So graft harvesting, lots of different potential sites for harvesting or procurement of that graft material. It's not always the saphenous veins. Probably the most attractive or the best vessel to use would be either one of the mammary arteries. First of all, it only involves 1 anastomosis, which prevents some of the scarring and things that you would see. It also is already an artery. And if you remember back to your days of anatomy, your basic anatomy, the makeup, the walls of an artery are very different than the walls of veins, and they have more elasticity. They are really built to withstand the beating of the heart, so the pulsing that comes with being attached to the part of the heart that is getting oxygen to the body. But you only have 2. So there's only really so much you can do with the internal mammary arteries. The next one that we see most commonly is the saphenous vein, which is a nice long vein that runs all the way down the leg. They can take that out without causing too many problems for the patient. And again, that would be a free graft. Another type of free graft that we see quite a bit is the radial artery in the forearm. they would remove that completely and move it over to the heart. A couple of others, they might use the inferior epigastric artery or the gastroepiploic artery, and a lot of times this is an in situ graft where they're just pulling that up to the heart. It's not super close, but you know, it is in an area where they could do that. So your root operation for graft harvesting, if it's a free graft, not a pedicle or an in situ graft, because remember, those are not considered to be devices. But for a graft harvesting, you're going to use the root operation excision. And this is just an example because, again, saphenous vein harvesting is probably going to be the most common that we would see. And it's the 06B table. Could also be, if they did the radial artery harvesting, that would be in the upper artery body system. And real simple, your qualifier, and this is going to be no qualifier because this is being used for graft material. It's not considered to be a diagnostic procedure. One other aside here, and I haven't seen this yet. I don't know if you're doing this in your facility. There is a new technology called Duragraft where they treat the vein graft during the bypass procedure in order to prevent future graft failure. So they take the saphenous vein graft and they flush it and soak it in this tissue preservation solution, and as soon as they harvest it and up until the point right before they do the anastomosis. And this was a new technology a couple of years ago. It's assigned to the XY0 table. XY0, you can see the body part is the vein graft. The approach is external because this is all done outside the body. You know, you're coating, you're harvesting, but then this is for placing it in this solution and to help, you know, prevent this endothelial damage. For me, what I like to do with these new technology procedures is if you're old-fashioned like me and you still have a code book and get a code book every year, I write the technology into the table next to it so that I know what those keywords are. The example here is Duragraft. If you don't like to write this stuff in your code book or you don't have a code book, I highly recommend our PCS flip bits, which you can find on our website in our marketplace, and we list them all out for you, what those new technologies are along with their trade names, because you're more likely to see the physician document Duragraft than this endothelial damage inhibitor. But if you have one of those cases and you want to, you know, de-identify it, redact all the patient information and send it to me, I'm a collector. I love to collect op reports. Cardiopulmonary bypass. This is another procedure that we see done in addition to CABG. They can do some of the procedures off pump, but a lot of times, I think most of the time they are doing bypass procedures on pump. When I was a new coder, and I point these things out because these are things I struggled with when I was learning how to code, and sometimes I look back and think, oh, that was, you know, not kind of the smartest thing I was thinking, but if you don't know, you don't know. Cardiopulmonary bypass sounds really close to coronary artery bypass graft. Two completely different procedures. Cardiopulmonary bypass, or CPB, is what they do to slow down the heart and make sure that we're still getting perfusion to the entire body so that the body doesn't die during the surgery, while also slowing down that heart so it can be operated on more effectively. The procedural intent is to take over cardiac and respiratory function during heart surgery. Now, how this is coded is it goes to performance of cardiac output, and it goes to performance because remember, the root operation definition of performance is taking over the function of a body part. And, you know, way back in the day when I was first learning PCS, 10 years ago, we were coding out both the cardiac and the respiratory piece separately, and then they came out and said, no, just code the cardiac output piece of this to report cardiopulmonary bypass. But what this involves is putting in cannulas that on the aorta as well as on the vena cava, and the blood, the arterial circulation is going to go through, the venous circulation is going to go through a machine that's going to help oxygenate the blood and then return it to the aorta. So instead of having blood coming in through the vena cava into the heart and out the aorta, we now have blood coming into the vena cava, out to this machine, and back to the aorta, completely bypassing the heart in the process. That allows them to use cardioplegic solution to cool and slow down the heart again so that they can operate on it. Let's talk a little bit about redo CABGs. It was a question that was posed in Coding Clinic third quarter 2018. And the question was, how do you code for a redo of a coronary artery bypass? And in the article, and this is where you have to be really careful, and you've got to read your Coding Clinic articles really carefully. For the case that was presented to Coding Clinic, they said code it as bypass because it's a new bypass. But they also talk about the fact that had they done some sort of a procedure on the existing graft, it would have been revision. You got to be really careful when the physician says he's doing a redo CABG. What is he doing? Is he, maybe taking the existing graft and moving one of the Anastomoses sites? That would be revision. But if he's going in and saying, oh, wow, yeah, this patient had CABG done a few years ago, but one of his grafts is completely occluded, so we're going to make a new aortocoronary connection, then that's coded as bypass. It really depends on the procedure that's documented and the intent of that procedure. And it harks back to remembering our root operation definitions. Other procedures that you might see with CABG, coronary endarterectomy. Endarterectomy is where they take plaque out of the artery, and when they're doing coronary endarterectomy in preparation for CABG, they're usually trying to remove plaque from the area where they're going to bypass so that they have a nice soft vessel to sew into. And according to Coding Clinic, that is done to prepare for bypass, and therefore it is not coded separately. It's considered to be integral to the CABG. There are also a couple of coding clinics about releasing the coronary artery, and code assignment is going to be based on the intent. So there are two different articles that when you look at them at first glance, they seem to contradict each other. One of them says to code to release, the other one says no code. And just summarizing those articles, if the intent is to relieve a constriction on the coronary artery, it's coded as release. But if the intent is to mobilize that artery for bypass, and physicians use weird terminology as they're talking about this, they'll talk about dissecting out. That doesn't mean they removed anything. It means they're loosening everything up so that they can go in and do the bypass. When he talks about releasing the coronary artery, is he really removing a constriction, which is something we can code, or is he just mobilizing or dissecting out that artery to accommodate the bypass, in which case no code would be assigned. Intent, intent, intent. It's all about intent in ICD-10. Okay, that brings us to our second polling question. Michelle?
All right. So this question is, which of the following procedures is coded separately from CABG? Is it the release of coronary artery for mobilization, coronary endarterectomy, release of constricted coronary artery? So go ahead and select your answer, and we'll wait for everybody to respond, and then we'll do a brief discussion. All right. Which of the following procedures is coded separately from CABG? Release of coronary artery for mobilization, coronary endarterectomy, or release of constricted coronary artery? And we're just waiting for a few more. Okay, I think we got the majority, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. And it looks like we have 18% selected coronary endarterectomy and 82% selected release of constricted coronary artery.
Okay, so it looks like I didn't confuse anybody on the first one. Nobody fell for that. You don't code release of coronary artery for mobilization. That's considered part of preparing for the procedure. Coronary endarterectomy, remember, if it's done to prepare for CABG, is not coded separately. But if we have a constricted coronary artery that needs to be released, that can be coded separately. So the answer is the third one, release of constricted coronary artery. All right, thank you, Michelle. Let's talk about a couple of cardiac assist procedures. And you see our little heart graphic here. He looks really tired. And sometimes after heart surgery, the heart is really tired and it's having a hard time beating properly. And there are a couple of things that we can do to help strengthen the pumping action of the heart and make sure that we're getting good blood flow to the rest of the body while the heart is recovering. So the first one that we'll talk about is a percutaneous ventricular assist device, or a PVAD. And this particular one, we're not talking about ventricular assist devices that are used as a bridge to transplant. That's a much more involved device. We're talking about specifically the Impella, which is called an external heart assist device. This is a device that is placed into the femoral artery via a catheter and then up into the left ventricle of the heart. And it helps to, it attaches to an external machine that's going to help the heart to beat more efficiently. So there are a couple of things, and there are a lot of coding clinics that were written on this, but they recently added a qualifier of intraoperative. So it kind of changed the way that we code based off of some of the earlier coding clinics. And tried to summarize it all for you on this page. When a PVAD is used intraoperatively, and sometimes it may be used during a CABG procedure, you use the insertion table, the 02H table, with the qualifier J of intraoperative, and then there is a code for assistance, 5A0221D. There have been, like I said, long articles printed in Coding Clinic on how do you code this for insertion and removal. What if it's left in place after the procedure? And they say that if it's put in during the procedure and left after the procedure, you no longer use the intraoperative qualifier, and then you're also going to add a code for the removal of that device in addition to using the assistance code. This is a major summary of a lot of information with examples from Coding Clinic, and I would refer you back to fourth quarter of 2017 where they really discussed this in great detail if you are seeing the Impella. The intra-aortic balloon pump is also placed percutaneously, goes in through the groin by a catheter, but instead of being placed all the way into the heart, this is a long, skinny balloon that just sits within the aorta. And it works in conjunction with the heartbeat. So it works with the systole and diastole of the heart and inflates and deflates. When it inflates, it helps to build up pressure in the left ventricle, which can help to the heart to beat more effectively and more efficiently and stronger. This one is not coded as an insertion of a device, which to me doesn't make a ton of sense when we compare it to the Impella. But this particular one is just coded as assistance with cardiac output using a balloon pump continuous, so the code 5A02210, and there is a coding clinic on this one as well. And the pictures that we're showing here show the intra-aortic balloon pump with the balloon deflated, so you can see blood is able to get around the balloon through the aorta and to the different tissues of the body, and then with it inflated, which again is going to help build up the pressure within the left ventricle. So it's all fun and games going through all of this information until you actually have to read an op report. And op reports, I think, can get pretty tricky, so I've included 2 examples here for you today. And I'm not going to read everything to you, but I did take the liberty of highlighting the stuff that I felt to be the most important in these procedures. I did reprint these exactly as they were, so some of the slides don't have highlights on them. But if you're a coder purist like me, you want to see the whole op report. So the procedure header in case study number 1, and we never code from the procedural header, but it's always nice to have a heads up of what we're about to get ourselves into. This particular one, he's saying that he did a cabbage ×3, and then he lists out what those 3 vessels were. He did a lima to the LAD, a reverse saphenous vein graft, SVG, to the high diagonal, and a reverse SVG to the distal RCA, proximal posterior lateral branch of the RCA. What does the reverse part mean? A reverse saphenous vein graft does not affect code assignment at all. Remember, back to your basic anatomy classes, that veins have valves in them, and those valves open and close to help prevent backflow of blood and pooling of blood in the veins. Well, in order to make this a graft that is going to work in the heart, they turn it around. So blood is going to be running the opposite direction of the way that it was running in the veins. And that's so those valves don't stop them up. So again, it doesn't make any difference for our code assignment, but know that this looks like we've got 1 arterial graft and 2 venous grafts. And he also says he did a video-assisted endoscopic vein harvesting. On the clinical background, some interesting stuff about the patient and a couple of operative findings, but nothing right now that's going to impact code assignment. And this is where I started to really get excited about color coding. So in yellow, they talk about the video-assisted endoscopic harvesting of the right greater saphenous vein. And remember that we can code the harvesting, that'll be coded as excision. The fact that it is endoscopic is important because that's going to affect our approach. And then, kind of hard to see, but in white, they talk about, he says, the lima was harvested as a pedicle graft. Ooh, danger. You see that word harvested and you're thinking, oh, I need to code another excision, but it's a pedicle graft, and when it's pedicle graft, still attached on one end, no code assignment for that one. And then in green, he starts to talk about the patient being placed on cardiopulmonary bypass and cardioplegia administered. I spent a lot of time talking about cardiopulmonary bypass earlier because they talk about it a lot in the operative reports. And as a coder, when I was first learning to code this, I'm looking at it going, this seems like a really big deal, and it seems like I should be coding a whole bunch of things here. And my response to that now is it is a really big deal, because obviously we need to be able to keep the heart or the body alive while we're operating on the heart. Cardiopulmonary bypass, absolutely a big deal, but it's one code. lots of description in an operative report for one code, and that's again in green. He talks about doing the systemic cooling. They are bringing the patient's body temperature down. It helps slow the heart rate down a little bit. And then they did the aortic cross clamp. They did the cardioplegia, and again, just general cooling of the heart. In blue, we see the discussion of the coronary artery anastomoses using the saphenous vein graft. So using an individual saphenous vein graft, he did a side-to-side anastomosis between the distal third of the vein graft and the high diagonal artery. So there's one. And then attention was turned to the RCA, where the posterolateral branch of the RCA and an arteriotomy was performed, and then he did a reverse saphenous vein graft anastomose to that. So we have 2 arterial or coronary artery sites that have been connected to a saphenous vein graft. And then in this nice fuchsia color, the LAD was exposed and open longitudinally, and the lima was anastomosed. And there is our arterial graft. So we have 1, 2, 3 grafts, just like he said in the procedure header. That doesn't always happen, but sometimes it does. So the completion and closure in green, because they cooled the patient down, now they've got to warm the patient up. We're taking the patient off of bypass. We're starting to warm the heart up. But if you recall, there's one important step that he hasn't done yet. He connected 2 saphenous vein grafts to the coronary arteries, but he needs to connect the proximal end of those to the aorta, and that's shown in blue. Seems like this should be a separate code, but this is completion of the saphenous vein graft bypass. And remember, we're not going to see the same thing for the arterial because it was already connected at the proximal end. We didn't have to make that a free graft. And then he completely weaned cardiopulmonary bypass. So case study 1, codes. If you remember back to the beginning of my presentation, I talked about the coding guideline that says that if you have bypass that uses 2 or more bypass that use different devices and or qualifiers, then you have to code those out separately, and that's what we're seeing here. So we did bypass of 2 coronary arteries using autologous venous tissue, open approach. This is my saphenous vein bypass, but it doesn't include my lima bypass. And in order to code that, I have an additional code. This one is 1 artery from the left internal mammary artery, open approach. And again, look at my my device character here is a Z, no device. It was a pedicle graft. It was left in place. So we have 2 vessels coming from the aorta to the coronary artery, and one vessel coming from the left internal mammary artery to the coronary. We also had excision of that right saphenous vein, percutaneous endoscopic approach because they did endoscopic harvesting, and then finally my code for coronary artery pulmonary bypass. And before we go into case study 2, we have one last polling question. Michelle?
Okay. So we have, how many codes are needed to report CABG using a free radial graft and an in situ lima graft? Is it 1 or 2? How many codes are needed to report CABG using a free radial graft and an in situ lima graft? 1 or 2? Oh, this one's going to be a good one. You look like we're pretty split on this one. See if we can get a few more responses to come in. One or 2. All right, give you a few more moments to select your answer. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and close this poll. We have 36% selected 1 and 64% selected 2.
Okay, so you had a 50-50 shot at this one. Which one is correct? The correct answer on this one is 2. Now, why? We didn't talk about where the blood flow was coming from for the free radiograft, so we can't really tell based off of qualifiers that this is going to be 2 separate codes. But the reason I can tell this is 2 is because we had one free graft, which is a device, and we had one Lima graft, which is an in situ graft. So in situ, no device. Free graft is a device. If you have different devices, then you have to have separate codes. Thank you, Michelle. All right, last case study. And this one, I felt like I just hit a gold mine when I found this one. And a big shout out to mtsamples.com for letting us borrow this case study. If you are not aware, MT Samples is a website that has nothing but medical transcription. None of it's coded, but except for this one that I'm about to show you. But if you're looking for some reports for coding practice or discussion, it's an awesome place to go. So in this one, this procedure, he says he's doing coronary artery bypass grafting times 4. He says he did a Lima to the LAD. He did a left radial artery from the aorta to the PDA, that's the posterior descending artery, and a left saphenous vein graft from the aorta sequential to the diagonal obtuse marginal. We have 3 types of graft material, Lima, radial, and saphenous vein graft, but this saphenous vein graft was a sequential graft that went to 2 different coronary arteries. So he really did do 4 bypass grafts, assuming that that's what's in the operative report. And spoiler alert, that is what's in the operative report. So again, findings and approach, just in case you want to see the entire operative report, like I always want to see the entire operative report, and then getting into the graft harvesting. In this particular one, again, the white highlight on this gray background is kind of hard to see, but he talks about the left internal mammary artery being taken down. And that's just his way of saying that, you know, we're disconnecting that distal end and getting ready for that bypass. At the same time, he went to the left forearm and took the radial artery endoscopically. And then from the left leg, he took the saphenous vein endoscopically. And we now have all of our graft material available. Again, in green, we have a whole paragraph with a few keywords highlighted talking about the cardiopulmonary bypass and getting the patient started on that, and then the bypass itself. So in pink or fuchsia, whatever color you want to call it, all of our arterial grafts are shown. So we have the arteriotomy on the PDA. So you opened up the posterior descending artery, and then he did an end radial to side PDA anastomosis. So we've got the connection of our radial artery. He then moved down in blue to the venous, where he did the posterior obtuse marginal and anastomose the saphenous vein to the obtuse marginal, and then used the same graft to the diagonal. And we now have a single graft material that is providing blood supply to the obtuse marginal and the diagonal. And then finally, the LAD was bypassed using the Lima. So the aortic connection. Remember that the slide previously was just talking about the anastomoses on the coronary end. We have 3 vessels, or actually 2 vessels that are not connected, or 2 graft material that are not connected. So the 2 proximal anastomoses were constructed between the proximal end of the saphenous vein graft and the side of the aorta. Remember, the saphenous vein is jumping over. We only need to make 1 connection at the aorta for the saphenous vein graft, and then it's jumping over to 2 separate arteries. And then in fuchsia, the proximal end of the radial graft, because this was a free graft. Lima, we don't have to worry about that proximal anastomosis, but we do on the radial graft, which was also anastomosed to the aorta. And then everything in green is about weaning the patient off of cardiopulmonary bypass, more weaning and closure. and then our code assignment. So we're going to have 3 separate codes because we have 3 different types of devices that are used, and we have, in total we have different combinations, 3 different combinations of devices and qualifiers. So I always put the saphenous vein first because it's usually more sites. I don't think it really matters how you sequence these. Certainly not going to impact your DRG assignment. But 021109W for bypassing the 2 coronary arteries from the aorta using the vein, the saphenous vein. Then we have 02100AW. This is my radial graft. Notice that my 6th character is not Z. This was a free graft using autologous arterial tissue, so my qualifier is A. And it was connected to the aorta, so my qualifier is W. Did I say my qualifier was A? My device was A. And then bypass the coronary artery from the internal mammary artery. My device here is a Z, no device, and my qualifier is the Lima. Couple of extra harvesting codes. We harvested both the left saphenous vein and the left radial artery, both using endoscopic approach, and we did our cardiopulmonary artery bypass. And that brings me right to time. Here's a list of the references that I used on today's presentation. I don't have time to take questions, but you can still put your questions in the chat window or shoot me an email, and look for our YouTube that will release within the next few days that answers all of the questions that came out of today's webinar. And that's going to do it for me. Michelle, do you want to close us out?
Sure. Thank you, Christy. It was great presentation, good anatomy pictures and information. So thank you. Again, we don't have time for questions today. If you did submit a question, it will be in that follow-up FAQ video, and we will post it on our YouTube channel at HCGTV. Thank you for joining us. We hope you join us again for any of our upcoming webinars. Our next one is November 21st. For CPT coding for vascular access devices, and I believe that will be with Shay Lunt. Thank you.